Welcome to the Duck Dive. This is where we dive deep just for you. We take interesting ideas, maybe complex ones, and try to make them clear and engaging.
Yeah, no overwhelm, just getting straight to the core of it.
Exactly. And today, we're exploring the thought of Ibn Taymiyyah. He's a major figure in Islamic theology.
A really significant thinker. And we're focusing on something specific. His ideas about creation, how things come into being.
Our source for this is a fascinating Twitter thread by @MohammedFikri on the Threadreader app. It really gets into the weeds on one particular point.
It does. A debated point, actually.
Right. So the big question for this deep dive is, did Ibn Taymiyyah believe God always creates using stuff that's already there, like pre-existing material?
Or could God, in his view, also create something completely out of nothing? That concept, ex nihilo.
That's the core of it, and the thread starts by pointing out there's disagreement on this.
Yeah, Abdur Rahman, for instance, suggests Ibn Taymiyyah thought God's creation aligns with his wisdom, but maybe doesn't strictly need prior material. But Muhammad Fikri, the author of the thread, argues pretty strongly that Ibn Taymiyyah actually came to believe that creating without any prior material cause is, well, impossible. Absolutely impossible for God.
Interesting. So our mission today is to really understand Muhammad Fikri's argument for that interpretation.
Exactly. He bases it heavily on one of Ibn Taymiyyah's later, very important works, Kitab al-Nubuwat, the Book of Prophecies.
Okay, so where does Muhammad Fikri start building this case?
He begins with the historical context, the intellectual climate Ibn Taymiyyah was operating in. It's pretty crucial for understanding his arguments.
Makes sense. So what was the backdrop? What were the competing ideas?
Well, you had this long-standing debate, mainly between the Kalam theologians
and
the Aristotelian philosophers. On creation, the Kalam generally said, look, creating from nothing ex nihilo, it's possible. We can conceive of it. It's a conceptual possibility.
So it's thinkable, therefore possible.
Kind of, yeah. For them, possibility was primarily conceptual. But the philosophers, the Aristotelians, they pushed back.
How so?
They argued that possibility isn't just an idea in your head. For something to be genuinely possible, that potential needs to be grounded in something real. Ontologically positive, they'd say.
Ontologically positive, meaning?
Meaning it needs a real basis, usually a material substrate, like the possibility of a statue exists in the marble.
Ah, okay. So if possibility needs matter,
then creating from absolute nothing becomes impossible, logically speaking. There's no stuff to hold the possibility.
Got it. No material, no potential.
Precisely. Now, Muhammad Fikri points out that in Ibn Taymiyyah's earlier writings, like Masalat Huduth al-Alam,
which deals with the world's beginning.
Right. In that work, Ibn Taymiyyah seemed to lean more towards the Kalam view, possibility as conceptual.
Okay, so he started there, but you said Muhammad Fikri argues he shifted.
Exactly. That's the key argument.
Yeah.
In the later Kitab al-Nubuwat, Muhammad Fikri says, Ibn Taymiyyah changes his tune. He starts arguing that the possibility of new things coming into being substantial origination is actually ontologically positive.
So possibility needs that real material grounding after all.
Yes, and that God creates strictly through causes, as Muhammad Fikri quotes him, stating that the possibility of substantial origination is an ontologically positive attribute, and that God creates strictly by way of causes.
Okay, ontologically positive. Let's just nail that down. It means the potential for something isn't just abstract, it's actually located in something that exists beforehand.
That's a really good way to phrase it. The potential is inherent in the prior material conditions. Now, here's the logical step that Muhammad Fikri highlights.
Go on.
If Ibn Taymiyyah now believes possibility requires this real material basis, wouldn't that automatically make creation from absolute nothing impossible?
It seems like it would have to, right? If there's no prior material basis in nothingness.
Exactly. And Muhammad Fikri's point is, if Ibn Taymiyyah didn't think this new position ruled out ex nihilo, you'd expect him to explain why it didn't.
But he doesn't.
According to the thread, there's no such explanation in Kitab al-Nubuwat. The silence is significant.
So the lack of a counter-argument becomes part of the evidence for this interpretation.
Yes, but it's not just an argument from silence. And Muhammad Fikri also points to several places in Kitab al-Nubuwat where Ibn Taymiyyah seems to hint at this impossibility before he even gets to the explicit statement about possibility being ontologically positive.
Okay, let's hear these hints. What's the first one? Reason 2 in the thread.
Reason 2 focuses on the causal principle, cause and effect.
Right.
And Muhammad Fikri argues that saying possibility is ontologically positive implies that causality is universally true, at least at the level of secondary causes, the natural world stuff we see.
Okay, connect that to ex nihilo for me.
Well, think about how we argue for God's existence.
Yeah.
We often point to the fact that things in the universe have causes, right? Effects need causes.
Sure, the cosmological argument relies on that.
Exactly. So if all natural effects need prior material causes, then the very fact that these things begin to exist points beyond that chain to an uncaused first cause, an external originator, God.
So the argument for God uses the necessity of causes within the universe.
Yes, as Muhammad Fikri puts it, if we maintain the universality of the causal principle, then the substantial origination of these natural effects will require an external originator a fortiori.
Okay, I see. So if you suddenly allow for creation ex nihilo within that system.
It potentially weakens the very argument for God based on causality, doesn't it? It introduces an exception. And Ibn Taymiyyah himself is quoted saying something like, things originating ex nihilo are somewhat similar to things originating without an originator.
Wow, that's quite a statement. It makes ex nihilo sound almost like spontaneous generation.
It pushes in that direction,
Wow.
yeah. It makes it seem less like a divine act and more like something just popping into being, which is problematic.
Okay, that's a strong hint. What's the third reason Muhammad Fikri brings up?
This one relates to avoiding theological misunderstandings. Ibn Taymiyyah is apparently concerned that if people thought things could be created without a material cause, they might start thinking those created things were somehow part of God or begotten from his essence. A confusion between the creator and the creation.
Ah, blurring that absolute distinction.
Exactly. The example used is the creation of Jesus without a human father. Some people wrongly concluded he was literally begotten by God.
Right, a common point of theological difference.
But Ibn Taymiyyah argued, no, even Jesus' creation involved material causes, Mary's substance and the angel Gabriel's breath, which itself acted upon matter.
So even miracles involve material processes in this view.
According to this interpretation, yes. And the impossibility of true ex nihilo helps maintain that boundary. If everything must arise from a prior substrate.
Then it has to arise from the created world substrate, not directly from God's essence.
Precisely. It protects the concept of God's utter transcendence. Like the Quran says, he begets not, nor is he begotten.
Okay, that makes sense theologically. What about reason 4?
Reason 4 involves angels and eternity.
Angels, how do they fit in?
Ibn Taymiyyah apparently addresses an argument. If angels weren't created from some kind of matter or substrate, wouldn't they have to be eternal?
Why eternal? What's the logic there?
The idea is that the material conditions, the substrate, carries the possibility of something coming into being at a certain time.
Yeah.
If there's no substrate, no material condition.
Then what determines if or when they are created?
Exactly. Without that contingent material basis for their possibility, they'd either be impossible, so they wouldn't exist, or they'd be necessary, meaning eternal, uncreated, existing alongside God.
Which is obviously problematic in Islamic theology.
Hugely problematic. So the fact that angels are created implies they must have some kind of substrate or prior condition that makes their creation possible without making them eternal.
So again, it points towards possibility being tied to some kind of prior condition, likely material.
That's the inference that Muhammad Fikri draws from Ibn Taymiyyah's discussion. It suggests possibility isn't just floating free, it's linked to the substrate, making ex nihilo creation difficult to fit in.
Okay, these hints are really building a picture. Now, reason 5 is about Ibn Taymiyyah's evolving views on material conditions themselves.
Yes. Muhammad Fikri stresses that Ibn Taymiyyah always thought material causes were important, never just optional extras. Even early on in Minhaj al-Sunnah, he'd say things like, humans are created from earthly elements, so they can't be created without them.
So specific creations need specific ingredients, basically.
Right, but it's more fundamental. Muhammad Fikri highlights Ibn Taymiyyah's view that preparing the right material causes is what actually makes the creation possible, at the level of second causation. Without those causes being ready, the thing can't originate in the natural order.
It remains impossible until the conditions are met.
Exactly. As the thread puts it, the possibility is not permanently true, but rather emerges due to God preparing the prior suitable material causes.
But this doesn't limit God's power, right? He can still create Adam from earth or Jesus miraculously.
No, it doesn't limit his ultimate power. God sets up the causes. He can use ordinary means, direct creation from elements, or miracles. But the type of secondary cause used still matters. It affects the outcome.
How so?
Muhammad Fikri uses a great analogy. Making water.
Huh.
You can make H2O by burning hydrogen or by burning wood. You get water either way,
Why?
but the overall result is different. Burning wood also produces carbon dioxide and ash. Burning hydrogen doesn't. The starting materials, the secondary causes, influence the total effect.
Okay, that illustrates the point well. The context matters.
It does. So how does this relate back to ex nihilo? Well, remember, earlier on, Ibn Taymiyyah was open to ex nihilo, partly because there wasn't, empirical proof against it back then.
Right, he mentioned that in Masalat Huduth Alam.
And in another work, Bayan Talbis al-Jamia, he even mused that maybe simple substances, the most basic elements, could be created ex nihilo, though he admitted we never see that happen.
Which fit with his earlier idea of possibility being conceptual.
Exactly. But once he shifts in Kitab al-Nubuwat to possibility being ontologically positive, needing that real grounding,
Then the basis for allowing ex nihilo, even for simple substances, seems to disappear.
that's at Muhammad Fikri's conclusion. The shift implies that all substances, simple or complex, must arise via material causes, according to Ibn Taymiyyah's later thought.
A really significant shift then. Okay, what's reason number 6?
This one's a bit more philosophical. It draws a distinction implied by the material causes only view.
Okay.
It suggests there are two kinds of possibility at play. First, there's God's inherent ability to create that resides purely in God himself.
His power, his will.
Right. But second, there's the possibility of the created thing itself coming into existence. And that possibility in this view resides in the material substrate.
Ah, so God's power acts upon the potential already present, in a sense, within the material world he has created.
Precisely. And Muhammad Fikri notes that Ibn Taymiyyah actually makes this distinction between God's ability and the substrate's potential in Kitab al-Nubuwat.
Interesting. Okay, reason 7 brings in Scripture. How does that support the argument?
This is quite direct. Muhammad Fikri points out that Ibn Taymiyyah explicitly justified his claim that possibility is ontologically positive by noting something important.
Which is?
That nowhere in the Quran or other scriptures does God ever mention creating something from absolutely nothing, with no prior material cause mentioned or implied.
That is a strong point. You'd think if ex nihilo was a key way God creates, it would be mentioned somewhere, wouldn't you?
That's exactly the rhetorical question Muhammad Fikri asks. Why would Ibn Taymiyyah use this lack of scriptural evidence if he didn't believe God always creates via material causes? It suggests the scriptural silence supports the no ex nihilo view.
Okay, very compelling. And the final reason, number 8.
This brings it all together with an analogy Ibn Taymiyyah uses.
An analogy.
Yes, he compares originating the entire genus of creation without any material cause to the genus of events originating without any cause at all, like God starting to act after a period of, well, not acting.
Whoa, okay. That sounds deep. Break that down.
Ibn Taymiyyah argued elsewhere that God's actions flow from his eternal will. There isn't a start to his acting. So just as God's ability to act implies prior divine activity, his eternal will, the possibility for any created thing to originate requires the prior existence of some material explanation or condition.
So you can't go from absolute nothingness, no material conditions, to potential existence.
Without first having some material condition emerge to ground that potential. As Muhammad Fikri puts it, the state of affairs in which substantial origination is impossible cannot move to a state of affairs in which substantial origination is possible without the prior emergence of a material explanation.
It's like saying potential itself needs a cause, needs to arise from something.
Exactly. It ties back to the idea that the possibility for each created thing becomes real only as God brings forth the necessary preceding material conditions.
Okay, so let's try and summarize the overall picture that Muhammad Fikri paints based on all these points.
The conclusion is that, according to this interpretation of Ibn Taymiyyah's later work, causal explanations are necessary everywhere, both inside God, so to speak, his wisdom, his purposes, and out here in the world in the chain of secondary causes.
But critically, this doesn't mean God depends on matter, right?
Absolutely not. That's crucial. God creates the causes and the effects. The chain of causes in the world ultimately stems from the chain of God's own creative acts and will. It's not that matter dictates things to God. It's that God's way of creating involves establishing these causal chains.
So God remains entirely self-sufficient, the ultimate source of everything, including the materials and the possibility they hold.
Precisely. Imam Fikri uses the contrast with the sun needing the atmosphere to make light rays visible. That's a kind of partnership. God doesn't partner with matter. He originates it and acts through it according to his wisdom.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, At Muhammad Fikri presents a really detailed case using textual evidence mainly from Kitab al-Nubuwat, arguing that Ibn Taymiyyah, in his mature thought, concluded that creation from absolute nothing ex nihilo is impossible.
Yes, and that God always creates via prior material causes, which he himself brings into being.
And the motivation behind the thread seems to be presenting this view as a robust, rational alternative to modern materialism.
That seems to be the underlying goal, yes, to show theology that affirms God and
Yeah.
aligns with our intuitions about causality in the universe.
It definitely gives you, the listener, a lot to think about. This idea of possibility itself needing a physical grounding, and what that implies about God's relationship with the world he created. What questions does that raise for you personally about how existence even began? Something to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.